Have you ever lost everything you thought would last forever? Have you ever stood in the ruins of your dreams, wondering if you have the strength to start over? Willa Langford knew that feeling all too well. On the dusty edge of Prairie Bend, she stood among the ashes of what used to be her barn, one season away from losing everything her late husband had built. She was too proud to beg and too stubborn to leave. Then two towering figures appeared at her fence, Jed and Eli Coulter, identical twins with shoulders like barn doors and dirt-smudged faces. They had patched trousers, blistered feet, and nowhere to go after being run out of the last town. "Please take us as your workers, Mom. We can do anything," Jed said, his voice deep but trembling. But what happens when salvation comes in the most unexpected form? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Langford apple orchard, painting the weathered fence posts in shades of amber and gold. Willa stood at her kitchen window, Harold's old work gloves still hanging on the hook beside the back door where he'd left them 2 winters ago. She touched the worn leather briefly, feeling the familiar ache that had settled in her chest like a permanent resident. 30 years they'd worked this land together. 30 years of sunrise coffees and sunset prayers, of spring plantings and autumn harvests. Harold had been the dreamer, always talking about expanding the orchard, maybe adding a proper barn, perhaps even getting into the cider business. Willa had been the practical one, keeping the books, mending what broke, making sure they had enough put aside for the lean years. She hadn't planned for this kind of lean year. The harsh winter of 1889 had been merciless. Snow piled higher than the fence posts, and the cold bit deeper than anyone could remember. They'd lost half their livestock to the freeze, and when the spring thaw finally came, it brought with it a fire that took what little they had left. The barn, the chicken coop, most of their toolsall reduced to the charred timbers that now served as a daily reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. Prairie Bend wasn't much of a town, just a cluster of buildings where the railroad stopped twice a week. But it was home to good people who'd known each other for decades. Doc Henley had been delivering babies and tending wounds for 40 years. Martha ran the general store with the efficiency of a cavalry sergeant and the heart of a church mother. Pastor Williams had married Harold and Willa in the little white church that sat on the hill overlooking the town. These were people who understood hardship, who'd weathered their own storms and helped neighbors through theirs. But there was a limit to how much help a person could accept before pride became a casualty too. Willa had been standing in the ruins of her barn that morning, calculating how much salvageable wood remained when she heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that spoke of men who'd walked many miles. She looked up to see them standing at her fence, 2 identical giants with faces that might have been carved from the same piece of oak. They were young, maybe in their 20s, but their eyes held the weight of men who'd seen too much of the world's harder edges. Both stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry a yoke and hands that looked capable of moving mountains. Their clothes were clean but patched, their boots worn thin from walking, and their faces bore the careful neutrality of people who'd learned to expect rejection. "Ma'am," the one on the left had said, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of autumn wheat. "I'm Jed Coulter, and this is my brother Eli. We've been walking since dawn, and we heard in town that you could use some help." Willa had studied them with the eye of someone who'd spent decades judging livestock and weather. They were clearly strong, clearly desperate, and clearly trying very hard not to appear threatening. The one called Eli hadn't spoken yet, but his hands worked nervously at the brim of his hat, and his eyes kept darting to the charred remains of her barn. "We don't have much money," she'd said carefully. "Times have been hard." "We don't need much," Jed had replied quickly. "Just a place to sleep and maybe a meal now and then. We're good workers, Ma'am. We can do anything that needs doing." Something in his voice, a tremor that spoke of pride swallowing itself, had made her decision. Not the smart decision, not the safe decision, but the only decision her heart would let her make. "There's not much shelter," she'd warned them. "The barn's mostly gone, and the house is small." We're used to sleeping rough." Eli had spoken for the first time, his voice softer than his brother's but carrying the same underlying strength. "We'd be grateful for whatever you can spare." That first night, she'd watched them from her kitchen window as they made beds in the ruins of the barn. They'd cleared a space among the charred timbers, spread their thin blankets on the ground, and settled in as if they'd done this many times before. They spoke quietly to each other, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of people who'd been companions through thick and thin. She'd found herself wondering about their story. Two men that size didn't go unnoticed in small towns. Where had they come from? What had brought them to her door? And why did they carry themselves like men who expected to be turned away? The next morning, she'd prepared breakfast for 3 instead of 1. It had been so long since she'd cooked for more than herself that she'd forgotten how good it felt to set a full table. The twins had eaten with the careful politeness of people who'd learned not to take hospitality for granted. They'd thanked her 3 times, helped clear the dishes, and asked what work she needed done. "The fence needs mending," she'd said, pointing to where the winter storms had knocked down several posts. "And the well pump has been giving me trouble." By noon, she'd realized she'd invited miracles to breakfast. Jed had lifted fence posts that would have required 2 normal men and a pulley system. Eli had dismantled the well pump with the patience of a clockmaker and the strength of a blacksmith. They worked with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice, but also with a gentleness that surprised her. When Eli had found a bird's nest in one of the apple trees, he'd spent 20 minutes carefully relocating it rather than simply removing it. Doc Henley had stopped by that afternoon, ostensibly to check on her health but really to get a look at the strangers. He was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the sort of practical wisdom that came from decades of dealing with both human nature and human frailty. "Big fellows," he'd observed, watching Jed reset a fence post single-handedly. "They're good workers," Willa had replied, a note of defensiveness creeping into her voice that surprised her. "I'm sure they are," Doc had said carefully. "Just be cautious, Willa. We don't know anything about them." But as the days passed, she began to feel like she was learning everything that mattered. She learned that Jed hummed while he worked, old hymns that her mother used to sing. She learned that Eli had a way with animals that bordered on Magical, the old milk cow, that had been skittish since the fire would eat from his hand like a tame house cat. She learned that they both said grace before meals, that they asked permission before using her well, and that they never took more than they were offered. Most importantly, she learned that they were as hungry for a place to belong as she was for help putting her life back together. The town's reaction was mixed. Martha from the general store was curious but cautious, asking pointed questions about where they'd come from and how long they planned to stay. Pastor Williams had nodded approvingly when she'd mentioned they were helping with the farm work, but she'd caught him watching them carefully during their first Sunday service. The younger men in town seemed divided between wariness and grudging respect for their obvious strength. But it was the children who accepted them first. Little Sarah Williams, the pastor's granddaughter, had approached Eli after church with the fearless curiosity of a 6-year-old. She'd asked if he was a giant from one of her fairy tale books, and when he'd knelt down to her level and gently explained that he was just a man who happened to be tall, she decided he was the most wonderful person in the world. By the end of their first week, Willa had made a decision that would have seemed impossible when she'd first watched them approach her fence. She was going to ask them to stay permanently. Not just because of the work they could do, though that was certainly part of it, but because of the way they'd begun to make her house feel like a home again. The sound of Jed's humming while he worked, the sight of Eli's careful hands tending her apple trees, the simple pleasure of cooking for 3, again these things had awakened something in her that she'd thought died with Harold. Not love, exactly, but something almost as precious, the sense that she was needed, that she had something to offer beyond her own survival. She'd been alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. The twins had reminded her that family wasn't always about blood, and that sometimes the people who needed you most were the ones who showed up at your gate with nothing but calloused hands and a willingness to work. As she watched them that evening, sharing a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, She realized that Harold would have liked them. He'd always had a soft spot for strays and underdogs, and he'd always believed that a man's character was revealed not by his circumstances, but by how he dealt with them. The twins had dealt with whatever had brought them to her door by walking until they found someone who needed help, then offering to provide it. In her book, that said everything about their character that needed saying. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask them to stay, not as hired help, but as family. Because sometimes the best things in life came walking up your road when you least expected them, carrying nothing but hope and the promise of better days ahead. The knock on Willa's door came at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, sharp and authoritative, in a way that made her stomach clench before she even saw who stood on her porch. She'd been washing breakfast dishes, listening to the sound of the twins working on the collapsed section of fence near the road, when the 3 measured raps echoed through her kitchen. Cornelius Thorne stood on her doorstep like a black-suited omen, his thin frame casting a shadow that seemed too large for his actual size. The banker had always reminded Willa of a crow-sharp-featured, black-clad, and possessed of an unsettling intelligence that missed nothing and forgot less. He held a leather portfolio under one arm and wore the expression of a man who took no pleasure in his duties, but would perform them with ruthless efficiency nonetheless. "Mrs. Langford," he said, touching the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. "I trust you're well this morning." "Well enough," Willa replied, not inviting him in. She'd known Cornelius Thorne for 15 years, had watched him foreclose on 3 other farms in the county, and had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded his visits. The portfolio, the formal tone, the way his eyes catalogued everything they saw, all of it pointed to news she didn't want to hear. "May I come in? We have business to discuss." She stepped aside reluctantly, watching as his gaze swept her modest kitchen with the calculating precision of a man who assessed everything in terms of monetary value. He declined her offer of coffee and went straight to the small table where she kept her household accounts, setting his portfolio down with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Mrs. Langford, I'm afraid the bank can no longer extend the grace period on your loan payments. Your husband's debt, combined with the interest that has accrued over the past 8 months since his passing, now totals $847. The number hit her like a physical blow. She'd known the debt was substantial, but Harold had always handled the finances, always assured her that they were managing. She'd been so focused on simple survival, keeping food on the table, maintaining what remained of the farm, that she hadn't fully grasped the scope of their financial troubles. 800, she repeated numbly. "And $47. Thorne corrected with the precision of a man who understood that $47 could be the difference between hope and despair. "The bank requires full payment within 30 days, or we'll be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings." Through the window, she could see Jed lifting a fence post that would have required a team of horses to move. The sight of his easy strength, his complete absorption in the work, made her throat tighten with emotions she couldn't quite name. In just 1 week, the twins had become part of the rhythm of her days. The thought of losing not just the farm, but also the fragile sense of family she'd begun to rebuild, felt like losing Harold all over again. "Mrs. Langford," Thorne's voice cut through her thoughts, "do you understand what I've told you?" "I understand," she said quietly. 30 days. "The bank would be willing to discuss alternative arrangements," he continued, his tone suggesting that such arrangements would not be in her favor. "There are parties interested in purchasing farmland in this area. Good, flat land, suitable for development. We could arrange a sale that would satisfy the debt and leave you with a small sum to relocate." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. She knew what he was really saying, that he had buyers lined up, probably at well below market value, and that her financial desperation made her the perfect target for a quick, profitable transaction. "I'll need time to consider my options," she said. "Of course. 30 days, Mrs. Langford. The bank will require payment in full by October 15th. After he left, Willa sat at her kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice he'd left behind. The official language seemed designed to drain hope from the room words like default and seizure and auction that reduced 30 years of marriage and dreams to a series of legal procedures. She was still sitting there when the twins came in for their midday meal, their faces flushed from morning work and their hands clean from the pump outside. They took one look at her face and exchanged a glance that spoke of people who'd learned to read trouble in others' expressions. "Ma'am," Jed said carefully, "everything all right?" She handed him the notice without speaking, watching as he read it with the careful attention of someone who'd encountered such documents before. His face darkened as he reached the bottom, and when he passed it to Eli, she saw his jaw clench with suppressed anger. $800, Eli said softly, as if speaking the number too loudly might make it grow larger. "In 30 days, Willa confirmed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't have it. I don't have half of it." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind through the apple trees. Willa found herself thinking about Harold, about all the plans they'd made, all the dreams they'd shared. They'd never been wealthy, but they'd been secure, or so she'd thought. Now she wondered how many nights he'd lain awake worrying about money while she'd slept peacefully beside him. "We could work for free," Jed said suddenly. "Whatever you've been paying us, you could save that toward the debt." "It wouldn't be enough," Willa replied, though she was touched by the offer. "And you deserve to be paid for your work. We deserve to have a place to stay more than we deserve money." Eli said quietly, "This is the first real home we've had since." He stopped abruptly, as if he'd revealed more than he'd intended. "Since when?" Willa asked gently. The twins exchanged another look, and she saw years of shared hardship pass between them in that single glance. It was Jed who finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "Since we aged out of the orphanage, we've been looking for a place to belong for 7 years, ma'am. This is the first place that's felt like it might be possible." The simple honesty of the statement broke something loose in Willa's chest. These two young men, who could have made their way anywhere with their strength and work ethic, were choosing to tie their fate to a failing farm and a woman who might lose everything within a month. "I can't ask you to stay if I might not be able to keep the place," she said. "You're not asking," Eli replied. "We're offering." That afternoon, they worked with a desperate efficiency that spoke of people racing against time. The collapsed fence section was not just repaired, but reinforced. The apple trees were pruned and tended with the care of gardeners planning for decades of future harvests. The twins threw themselves into every task, as if their own future depended on the farm's success, which, Willa realized, it probably did. She found herself watching them work and thinking about families, about the different ways people could belong to each other. She'd spent 2 years believing that her life had ended with Harold's death, that the best she could hope for was to maintain what they'd built together until age or infirmity forced her to give it up. But the twins had changed that calculation. They'd reminded her that building something worthwhile wasn't a solitary endeavor, that the strength of 2 willing hands could multiply exponentially when joined by 4 more. More than that, they'd reminded her what it felt like to be needed, to have people depending on her for more than just employment. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Willa made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She was going to fight for the farm, not just for herself, not just for Harold's memory, but for the fragile family that had taken root in her kitchen over shared meals and quiet conversations. $800 was a fortune she didn't possess, but it wasn't an impossible sum. There had to be ways to raise money, people who might be willing to help, options that Cornelius Thorne hadn't mentioned because they didn't serve his interests. She thought about the apple harvest that would come in another month, about the fruit trees that were healthier than they'd been in years, thanks to Eli's careful tending. She thought about the improvements the twins had already made, the work they could accomplish if given the chance to stay permanently. Most importantly, she thought about the look in their eyes when they'd offered to work for free, not the look of employees protecting their jobs, but the look of sons protecting their home. The foreclosure notice still lay on her kitchen table, but it no longer felt like a death sentence. It felt like a challenge, and Willa Langford had never been one to back down from a fight when something important was at stake. Tomorrow, she would begin exploring her options. She would talk to Doc Henley, who knew everyone in 3 counties. She would visit Martha at the general store, who heard all the local gossip and might know of opportunities Willa hadn't considered. She would even swallow her pride and ask Pastor Williams if the church might be able to help. But tonight, she would cook dinner for her family, because that's what they were now, she realized. Not by blood or law, but by choice and circumstance, and the simple fact that they'd all decided they belonged together, and sometimes that was the strongest foundation of all. The transformation of the Langford farm over the following week bordered on miraculous. Each morning, Willa would wake to the sound of purposeful activity, the rhythmic thud of hammer on wood, the creak of pulleys, the soft murmur of the twins conferring over some aspect of their work. By the time she had coffee brewed and breakfast on the table, they would appear at her back door with faces already flushed from exertion and eyes bright with the satisfaction of tasks accomplished. Jed had tackled the well repair with the methodical precision of a man who understood machinery in his bones. The old pump that had wheezed and stuttered for months now drew water with smooth efficiency, filling buckets with the clear, cold water that made the difference between thriving and merely surviving on a farm. But it was the care with which he worked that impressed Willa most, the way he cleaned each component before reassembly, the way he tested every connection twice, the way he spoke to the machinery as if coaxing cooperation from an old friend. Eli's gentle touch with the apple trees revealed an understanding of growing things that went beyond mere knowledge. He moved through the orchard like a man reading a familiar book, identifying diseased branches with a glance, spotting insect damage that Willa had missed, knowing instinctively which trees needed water and which needed pruning. Under his care, the orchard began to show signs of renewed vigor that she hadn't seen since Harold's illness had forced him to neglect the more delicate aspects of farm management. It was while watching Eli work among the trees that she discovered his secret talent. He'd been sitting on a overturned bucket during his brief lunch break, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he shaped something from a piece of applewood. When Willa approached, he looked up with the bashful expression of a child caught at play. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, starting to put the carving away. "I know I should be working." "What is it?" she asked, genuinely curious. He held up a small wooden robin, perfectly proportioned and detailed down to the individual feathers. The carving captured not just the bird's appearance, but something of its essential nature, the alert tilt of the head, the sense of barely contained energy that characterized the species. "It's beautiful," Willa said, meaning it. "Where did you learn to carve like that?" "Taught myself," Eli replied, his cheeks coloring slightly. "In the orphanage, there wasn't much to do in the evenings. Found some wood scraps and started whittling. Kept me out of trouble." The casual mention of the orphanage opened a door that Willa had been hesitant to walk through. She'd sensed that the twins carried painful histories, but she'd learned not to push for information people weren't ready to share. Now, seeing Eli's obvious pride in his carving, she felt invited to ask gentle questions. "How old were you when you went to the orphanage?" 12, Eli said, his hands still working the wood. "Both of us. Our parents died in a mine collapse outside Denver. We didn't have any other family, so the state split us up. Sent me to a place in Colorado Springs, sent Jed to one in Pueblo. Didn't see each other again until we turned 18 and got turned out." The matter-of-fact way he related this tragedy spoke of years spent learning to carry grief without letting it consume him. Willa found herself thinking about her own losses, Harold's death, the fire, the financial troubles, and realized that her sorrows, while real, had been cushioned by decades of love and security that these young men had never known. "That must have been hard," she said quietly, "being separated from each other." "Hardest thing we ever went through," Eli admitted. "Jed was all I had left of home, and suddenly he was gone too. We both wrote letters, but they got lost or thrown away. Took us 3 months after we got out to find each other again." That evening, over a dinner of fried chicken and vegetables from Willa's garden, the conversation turned to their years of searching for steady work. The twins spoke carefully, but Willa could read between the lines of their stories. They'd been turned away from job after job, not because they lacked skill or willingness, but because their size made people nervous. Employers worried they'd intimidate customers or be too expensive to feed. Boarding houses refused them rooms, claiming they didn't have beds large enough. Even churches had been unwelcoming, viewing them as potential troublemakers rather than parishioners seeking community. "People see us coming across the street," Jed said with resigned acceptance. "Can't blame them, I suppose. We know we look intimidating." "You don't look intimidating to me," Willa said firmly. "You look like men who've learned to work hard and be grateful for opportunities." The simple statement seemed to affect them deeply. Eli ducked his head over his plate, while Jed cleared his throat roughly before speaking. "Means a lot to hear you say that, ma'am." It was Martha from the general store who brought the first hint of outside complications. She arrived on Friday afternoon with a basket of supplies Willa had ordered, but her real purpose was clearly to satisfy her curiosity about the giants everyone in town was talking about. Martha was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, but she'd always been fair in her dealings and generous with neighbors in need. She'd known Willa for 20 years and had been one of the first to offer help after Harold's death. Now she studied the improvements to the farm with the keen attention of someone taking inventory. "Place looks better than it has in months," she observed, watching Jed repair a section of porch railing that had been sagging since the previous winter. "Those boys certainly know how to work." "They do indeed," Willa agreed, pride creeping into her voice despite her attempt to remain neutral. "Folks in town are curious about them." Martha continued carefully. "Don't often see strangers that size pass through Prairie Bend. People are wondering where they came from, how long they're planning to stay." The subtext was clear. Martha was fishing for information to satisfy the town's collective curiosity. Willa understood the impulse sign, a small community. Strangers were either potential assets or potential problems, and people wanted to know which category applied. "They're good workers and decent men," Willa said simply. "That's all that matters to me." "Of course," Martha agreed quickly. "But you understand how people worry. We don't know anything about their past, what brought them here." "I know they showed up when I needed help most," Willa replied, her tone carrying a note of finality that discouraged further probing. "Sometimes that's enough." After Martha left, Willa found herself thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about small-town dynamics. She'd lived in Prairie Bend long enough to understand how gossip worked, how quickly speculation could harden into accepted fact. The twins' obvious strength and mysterious past made them natural subjects for whispered conversations and sideways glances. But she'd also seen how they interacted with the few townspeople they'd encountered. At the general store, they'd been unfailingly polite, stepping aside to let others pass first, speaking quietly, paying for their purchases without haggling. When little Sarah Williams had approached Eli after church, he'd knelt down to her level and answered her questions with gentle patience. These were not the actions of men with something to hide or reasons to fear scrutiny. That Sunday, their second in Prairie Bend, Willa made a point of sitting with the twins in church and introducing them to anyone who approached. She watched Pastor Williams include them in his opening remarks, welcoming visitors and newcomers to the congregation. She saw Doc Henley nod approvingly when Jed helped an elderly parishioner down the church steps. She noticed how naturally they fit into the rhythm of community worship, adding their voices to the hymns, bowing their heads during prayers, listening attentively to the sermon. After the service, she invited several neighbors over for Sunday dinner, a clear signal that she considered the twins part of her household and expected them to be treated as such. The meal was a success, with Eli charming the ladies by asking for their gardening advice and Jed impressing the men with his knowledge of farming techniques. By the time her guests left, Willa felt that the twins had passed their first major test of community acceptance. They'd proven themselves to be respectful, knowledgeable, and genuinely interested in becoming part of Prairie Bend's social fabric. As they cleaned up after dinner, she realized that her feelings toward them had evolved beyond simple gratitude for their help. They'd become part of her daily routine in ways both practical and emotional. She looked forward to their morning conversations over coffee, enjoyed their gentle arguments about the best way to approach various farm tasks, appreciated the way they always asked permission before using her tools or supplies. More than that, she'd begun to feel protective of them in a way that reminded her of her own maternal instincts. When she'd seen Martha's calculating expression, her first impulse had been to shield the twins from whatever judgment or gossip might follow. When she'd noticed other church members staring, she'd felt a fierce desire to demonstrate their worth and demand the respect they deserved. The realization surprised her. She'd spent 2 years learning to live alone, convincing herself that solitude was simply her new reality. Now she couldn't imagine going back to the empty house, the silent meals, the absence of purpose that had characterized her existence before the twins' arrival. They'd given her more than physical help with the farm. They'd given her a reason to plan for the future, to believe that the best of her life might not be behind her. In return, she was determined to give them what they'd been searching for, a place to belong, a family to call their own, and the security of knowing they were valued for who they were, rather than feared for what they looked like. The foreclosure notice still sat on her kitchen table, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. With the twins' help, the farm was more productive than it had been in years. The apple harvest would be substantial, the livestock were thriving, and the property improvements were increasing its value daily. More importantly, she now had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. She had a family to protect and a future to secure. That made all the difference in the world. The discovery of Jed's journal happened by accident on a Tuesday morning when Willa was bringing him fresh water while he worked on reinforcing the chicken coop. A gust of wind had blown the leather-bound book open, scattering its pages and revealing neat, careful handwriting, interspersed with pressed flowers and detailed sketches of plants. "I'm sorry," she said, helping him gather the scattered papers. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's all right, Ma'am," Jed replied, though his cheeks had colored with embarrassment. "Just some notes I keep about farming and such." But as she handed him the pages, Willa caught glimpses of content that went far beyond simple agricultural observations. The handwriting was elegant, educated, not what she would have expected from someone who'd grown up in an orphanage. The sketches showed a trained eye for detail and beauty, and the pressed flowers had been arranged with the care of someone who understood their scientific as well as aesthetic value. "You write beautifully," she said gently, "and these drawings are quite accomplished." Jed's embarrassment deepened, but she could see pride fighting with shame in his expression. "Had a teacher at the orphanage who thought I showed promise, gave me some books, taught me proper penmanship. Didn't seem practical at the time, but I've always enjoyed it." That evening, after dinner, Willa asked if he might be willing to share some of his observations about her apple trees. What followed was a revelation that completely changed her understanding of the quiet young man she'd thought she was getting to know. Jed's journal contained detailed notes about soil composition, weather patterns, and plant behavior that demonstrated not just natural intelligence, but systematic education. He documented the recovery of various trees on her property, noted which varieties were thriving and which were struggling, and developed theories about optimal pruning and fertilization techniques that showed genuine scientific understanding. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked, marveling at a detailed diagram of root systems. "Books, mostly," Jed replied. "The orphanage had a small library, and I read everything they had about agriculture and horticulture. After Eli and I got out, we worked on enough farms to test what I'd learned against real experience." "And you remember all of this?" Willa gestured at the pages of careful observations. "Have to write it down," Jed said simply. "Too much to keep in my head, and I like being able to look back and see what worked and what didn't." That night, after the twins had retired to their makeshift quarters in the rebuilt section of the barn, Willa sat at her kitchen table thinking about the complexity of people and how wrong first impressions could be. She'd seen two large, strong men who needed work and could provide valuable labor. She hadn't seen the scholar and the artist hidden beneath their rough exterior. The next morning, she found herself looking at them with new eyes. Eli's gentle handling of the farm animals wasn't just instinctive kindness, it was informed by real understanding of animal behavior and welfare. Jed's systematic approach to repairs and improvements wasn't just good work. It was the application of genuine engineering principles to practical problems. Over breakfast, she encouraged them to talk about their experiences in different places, and the stories that emerged painted a picture of 7 years spent accumulating not just work experience, but real knowledge about agriculture, animal husbandry, and rural economics. They'd worked on cattle ranches in Colorado, fruit farms in Kansas, grain operations in Nebraska. Each job had taught them something new, and Jed had faithfully recorded it all in his journal. "Why haven't you started your own farm?" Willa asked. "With your knowledge and skills, you could certainly make a success of it." The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks, and it was Eli who answered. "Takes money to buy land," he said quietly. "Takes credit to get loans, takes references to establish yourself in a community. We've never stayed anywhere long enough to build those kinds of relationships." "Why not?" Willa pressed gently. Another look passed between them, this one shadowed with old pain. Jed closed his journal carefully before speaking. "People get nervous about us after a while," he said. "We're too big, too strong, too different. Small things start going missing, or someone gets hurt in a bar fight, and folks start looking at us suspiciously. Usually easier to move on than try to prove we're not responsible." "Has that happened often?" "Often enough," Eli said with resigned acceptance. "Last place was a farm outside Dodge City. Owner's prize bull got loose and charged a neighbor's child. Little girl wasn't hurt, thank goodness, but folks said the bull had been spooked by strangers. We left that night rather than wait for an official accusation." The casual way they related this injustice made Willa's heart ache. She could imagine how it must feel to be blamed for accidents and crimes simply because of their appearance, to know that their size made them convenient scapegoats whenever something went wrong in a community. "But you stayed there 6 months, she observed, having heard them mention that particular job before. "Longest we've stayed anywhere since the orphanage," Jed confirmed. "Thought maybe we'd finally found a place where we could put down roots. The owner seemed to appreciate our work, and the other hands treated us fairly. Started to hope that things might be different." "Until they weren't," Eli added quietly. That afternoon, as she watched them work with their usual efficient cooperation, Willa found herself thinking about belonging and the difference between temporary employment and permanent home. The twins had spent 7 years proving themselves over and over again, only to be forced to start fresh with each new job. No wonder they carried themselves with the careful reserve of people who'd learned not to invest too heavily in any particular situation. But something was different about their time on her farm. She could see it in the way they'd begun to make small improvements that wouldn't benefit them if they planned to leave soon the flower garden. Eli had started near the kitchen window, the reading nook Jed had built in the barn where he could study by lamplight. These were the actions of people who were beginning to believe they might have found a permanent home. The thought filled her with determination. She'd lost Harold, survived the fire and the brutal winter, and was facing financial ruin. But she wasn't going to lose these 2 young men who'd become the closest thing to family she had left. Somehow, she was going to find a way to keep the farm and give them the security they'd been searching for. That evening, she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of waiting for them to bring up the subject of permanent employment, she took the initiative. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," she said over dinner, "about making it more formal." The twins looked up from their plates, sudden tension visible in their postures. "Ma'am," Jed said carefully. "I'd like you to stay permanently," Willa said simply, "not as hired hands, but as partners. Equal shares in whatever we can make of this place." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the clock ticking in the parlor. Eli's fork hung suspended halfway to his mouth, while Jed stared at her with an expression of disbelief. "Partners?" Eli repeated. "You've done more in 3 weeks to improve this farm than I managed in 2 years, Willa said. "Your knowledge, your skills, your strength, they're what's going to make the difference between success and failure. It only seems right that you should share in whatever prosperity follows." "But the debt," Jed said, "the foreclosure notice." "We'll figure that out together," Willa replied with more confidence than she felt. "3 minds are better than 1, and we've got nearly a month to come up with solutions." She saw hope kindle in their eyes, quickly followed by the kind of caution that came from too many disappointments. They wanted to believe her offer was real, but they'd learned not to trust good fortune until it proved itself reliable. "Think about it," she said. "We don't have to decide everything tonight." But she could see from their expressions that the decision had already been made, at least in their hearts. They'd found what they'd been looking for, and they weren't going to let it slip away without a fight. After they'd retired for the night, Willa sat on her front porch, looking out over the farm they'd transformed together. The repaired fences, the thriving garden, the well-tended orchard, all of it represented not just physical improvement, but the rebuilding of hope itself. Tomorrow, she would begin exploring concrete options for raising the money needed to satisfy the bank. She would talk to neighbors about purchasing some of her apple harvest in advance, investigate whether any of her late husband's tools or equipment might be sold without compromising the farm's operation, and consider whether taking in boarders might provide additional income. But tonight, she allowed herself to believe that everything was going to work out exactly as it should. She had family again, purpose again, hope again, and sometimes that was enough to make even impossible things seem achievable. Sunday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Willa stood at her bedroom window, watching Jed and Eli prepare for church with the same careful attention they brought to every aspect of their lives. They'd spent Saturday evening cleaning and mending their good clothes, polishing their boots, and making sure they looked as respectable as their limited wardrobe allowed. It would be their 3rd Sunday attending Prairie Bend Community Church, but Willa knew the scrutiny hadn't lessened. If anything, the congregation's initial curiosity had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of grudging acceptance, lingering suspicion, and the kind of careful evaluation that small communities applied to anyone seeking permanent residence. She'd chosen her own dress with extra care this morning. The deep blue wool had been Harold's favorite, and wearing it always made her feel more confident, more capable of handling whatever challenges the day might bring. Today, she suspected she'd need all the confidence she could muster. The walk to church took them past several neighbors' properties, and Willa noted how people emerged from their houses to watch their progress. Some waved and called out greetings the Hendersons, who'd benefited from Jed's help fixing their broken windmill, and the young couple who'd recently moved to town and had no preconceptions about the twins. But others observed from windows or doorways with expressions that ranged from curious to openly wary. Pastor Williams greeted them at the church door with the warm sincerity that had made him beloved in Prairie Bend for 30 years. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see the good in everyone. But Willa had noticed how carefully he watched the congregation's reaction to the twins during their previous visits. "Beautiful morning," he said, shaking hands with each of them. "I was hoping you might stay after service today, Jed. I've been having trouble with the church bell mechanism, and Martha mentioned you have a way with mechanical things." It was a small gesture, but Willa recognized its significance. By publicly requesting Jed's help with church maintenance, Pastor Williams was signaling his acceptance and encouraging the congregation to view the twins as contributing members of the community rather than temporary curiosities. The service itself proceeded normally until Pastor Williams rose for his sermon. His text was from Hebrews. "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Willa felt a flush of warmth. understanding that the pastor had chosen his topic deliberately. "We live in a time when it's easy to be suspicious of newcomers," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the small sanctuary. "When unfamiliarity breeds fear and difference becomes grounds for distrust. But our faith calls us to something higher, to see the divine spark in every person who crosses our path." Willa glanced around the congregation, noting how some nodded approvingly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Mrs. Henderson, whose late husband's silver watch had gone missing the previous month, kept darting suspicious looks toward the twins. But little Sarah Williams, the pastor's granddaughter, had turned completely around in her pew to smile at Eli, who responded with a gentle wave. "I've been watching our newest neighbors," the pastor continued, "and I've seen men who work harder than most, who show respect for their elders, who handle children with gentleness and approach their duties with integrity. These are not the actions of people who deserve our suspicion, they are the actions of people who deserve our welcome." The sermon continued for another 20 minutes, weaving together themes of hospitality, judgment, and the Christian duty to welcome strangers. By the time Pastor Williams delivered his closing prayer, Willa felt that battle lines had been drawn not openly, but clearly enough for anyone paying attention to understand where various community members stood. After the service, the usual socializing on the church steps took on added significance. Willa made a point of introducing the twins to anyone they hadn't yet met formally, while keeping careful mental notes about who seemed genuinely welcoming and who maintained polite but distant formality. Doc Henley approached them with his characteristic directness, addressing the twins with the professional courtesy he showed all his patients. "How are you boys settling in?" he asked. "Any health concerns I should know about? Physical work can be demanding, especially for men your size." It was the kind of practical question that treated them as individuals rather than curiosities, and Willa saw both twins relax slightly at his matter-of-fact tone. "We're doing well, sir," Jed replied. "Mrs. Langford feeds us better than we've eaten in years." "Good to hear," Doc Henley said with approval. "Willa's always been an excellent cook, and I've noticed the improvements to her property. Fine work, both of you." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson, who approached with the determined expression of someone who'd been working up courage to speak. She was a woman in her 70s, widowed the previous year, and known for speaking her mind regardless of social consequences. "I hope you won't take offense," she said without preamble, addressing the twins directly. "But people are concerned about the recent thefts in town. My husband's silver watch, the miller's missing chickens, tools disappearing from various properties. You understand why folks might be nervous about strangers." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Willa felt her cheeks burn with indignation, but before she could respond, Eli stepped forward with quiet dignity. "We understand completely, ma'am," he said respectfully. "We've faced similar suspicions before, and we know how our appearance can make people nervous. All we can do is live our lives with integrity and hope that our actions speak louder than assumptions." The response was so measured, so free of defensiveness or anger, that Mrs. Henderson seemed taken aback. She'd clearly expected denials or protests, not this calm acknowledgement of reality combined with gentle insistence on their own character. "Well," she said, somewhat deflated, "I suppose time will tell." "It always does," Jed agreed quietly. After Mrs. Henderson moved away, Doc Henley shook his head with obvious disapproval. "Some people see shadows where there's only sunlight," he muttered. "Don't let it discourage you." The walk home was quieter than usual, and Willa could see that the confrontation had affected the twins, despite their composed response. They carried themselves with the careful posture of people who'd learned to expect disappointment but refused to be broken by it. "Mrs. Henderson lost her husband last year," Willa said finally. "Sometimes grief makes people look for someone to blame, even when there's no logical connection." "We know," Eli said simply. "We've seen it before." "But it still hurts," Willa observed. "Every time," Jed confirmed. "You'd think we'd get used to it, but you never really do." That afternoon, while the twins worked on various farm tasks, Willa found herself in her bedroom, kneeling beside the cedar chest, where she kept Harold's most precious belongings. She lifted out his old Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling, and opened it carefully to pages marked with pressed apple blossoms from their wedding day 31 years ago. Harold had been a man of deep but quiet faith, someone who lived his beliefs rather than preaching them. She could almost hear his voice as she read familiar passages, could imagine his response to the morning's events. He would have been furious at Mrs. Henderson's public accusations, but he also would have been proud of how the twins had handled themselves. When she came downstairs, she found them in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner with the efficient teamwork they brought to every shared task. The sight of their large hands, carefully peeling potatoes and chopping onions, struck her as both endearing and somehow profound. These men who could move mountains were content to perform the most mundane domestic duties without complaint. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into her chair at the kitchen table, "about faith and community and what it means to belong somewhere." They looked up from their work, waiting for her to continue. "Harold and I used to read the Bible together most evenings," she said, holding up the worn book. "I haven't opened it much since he died, but I think I'd like to start again, if you'd be interested in joining me." The offer seemed to affect them deeply. Eli's knife paused mid-chop, while Jed turned from the stove with an expression of surprise and gratitude. "We'd be honored," Jed said quietly. "It's been a long time since we've had anyone to share scripture with." That evening, after dinner, they gathered in the small parlor, where Harold used to read by lamplight. Willa opened the Bible to one of Harold's favorite passages, Psalm 23, and began to read aloud. The familiar words seemed to fill the room with a peace that had been missing since her husband's death. When she finished, Eli spoke quietly. "That was one of the first passages I memorized in the orphanage, always brought comfort when things seemed hopeless. 'The Lord is my shepherd,'" Jed quoted softly. "I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters," Eli continued. "He refreshes my soul." As they spoke the ancient words together, Willa felt something healing in her heart that had been broken since Harold's death. Not romantic love, but something equally precious, the sense of family, of shared purpose, of belonging to something larger than individual survival. "I think Harold would have liked you both very much," she said when they'd finished the psalm. "He always said that a person's character was revealed not by their circumstances, but by how they responded to adversity." "Sounds like a wise man," Jed said. "He was, and he would have been proud to see how you've helped restore his farm, how you've brought life back to this place." They continued reading for another hour, taking turns with different passages, sharing quiet observations about faith and life, and the challenge of maintaining hope in difficult circumstances. It was the kind of evening Harold would have treasured, simple, peaceful, filled with the quiet communion that came from shared beliefs and mutual respect. As the twins prepared to retire to their quarters, Willa felt compelled to address the morning's events directly. "What Mrs. Henderson said today about the thefts and suspicions, I want you to know that I don't share those concerns." "We appreciate that," Eli said, "more than you know. But I also want you to understand that if anyone in this community has a problem with you, they have a problem with me. You're part of this family now, and families protect each other." The simple declaration seemed to overwhelm them. Jed cleared his throat roughly, while Eli's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "Thank you," Jed said finally. "That means everything to us." After they'd gone to their beds, Willa sat alone in the parlor, holding Harold's Bible and thinking about the strange turns life could take. 6 weeks ago, she'd been facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now she had family again, purpose again, hope again. The foreclosure notice still represented a serious threat, and she knew that community acceptance wouldn't come easily or quickly. But as she looked around the room at the mended furniture, the polished surfaces, the signs of care and attention that had been missing for so long, she felt confident that they would find a way through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had faith, they had each other, and they had the kind of determination that came from people who'd survived loss and found reasons to hope again. Sometimes that was enough to move mountains, at least to save a small apple farm on the edge of Prairie Bend. The photograph fell from Jed's spare shirt when Willa was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. It fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird, landing face up in the dirt where she couldn't help but see it. Two small boys, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, identical down to their serious expressions and the way they stood with protective arms around each other's shoulders. Willa picked up the faded image carefully, studying the faces that held echoes of the men she'd come to know. Even as children, Jed and Eli had possessed the quiet dignity that characterized them now. But their eyes held something that broke her heart, the wariness that no child should carry. The look of young people who'd already learned that safety was temporary and love was not guaranteed. She was still holding the photograph when Jed appeared around the corner of the house, returning from his work in the orchard. He stopped short when he saw what she held, his face cycling through embarrassment, resignation, and something that might have been relief. "I'm sorry," Willa said quickly. "It fell out when I was hanging your shirt. I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," Jed replied, though his voice carried the careful neutrality he used when discussing painful subjects. "Just an old picture from the orphanage." She handed it back to him, noting how gently he held it, despite its obvious age and wear. "You were beautiful children," she said softly. A smile flickered across his face, brief but genuine. "Eli always said we looked like scared rabbits in that picture." Photographer came to the orphanage one day, said he was documenting conditions for some church organization, made all the children pose, but most of us didn't know what to expect. "How long before you were separated?" 3 months after this was taken. They said the orphanage was overcrowded, that some children would be transferred to other facilities. They made it sound temporary, like we'd see each other again soon. The casual way he related this fundamental betrayal made Willa's throat tighten with suppressed anger. She'd spent her entire adult life with Harold, 30 years of shared meals and quiet conversations, and the absolute certainty that they belonged together. These boys had been torn apart at an age when such security should have been unshakable. "That must have been terrifying," she said. "The worst part wasn't the separation itself," Jed admitted, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. "It was the not knowing. For 6 years, I didn't know if Eli was alive or dead, happy or suffering, whether he remembered me or had learned to stop caring. That uncertainty was harder to bear than any physical hardship." That evening, over dinner, the conversation turned to their reunion and the years that followed. It was Eli who provided most of the details, speaking with the quiet intensity of someone sharing long-held truths. They'd found each other through a combination of determination and luck. Both had been released from their respective orphanages on their 18th birthdays with a few dollars, a change of clothes, and no guidance about navigating the adult world. Jed had returned to Denver, the last place they'd been together, and spent 3 months working odd jobs while searching for any trace of his brother. "I asked at every church, every charity organization, every place that might keep records," he explained. "Most people were kind but couldn't help. Finally found a clerk at the territorial office who remembered processing paperwork for children from our original orphanage. Eli had been taking a similar approach, working his way back toward Denver from Colorado Springs. They'd finally crossed paths at a boarding house that catered to transient workers, recognizing each other instantly, despite 6 years of growth and change. "Best day of my life," Eli said simply. "Better than getting out of the orphanage, better than finding steady work, better than anything that happened before or since." "We swore we'd never be separated again," Jed added. "Whatever happened, wherever we went, we'd face it together." The depth of their bond was evident in everything they did, the way they communicated with glances, the way they automatically divided tasks based on each other's strengths, the way they seemed to function as two halves of a single consciousness. But Willa was beginning to understand that their loyalty to each other had also made them vulnerable in ways that single men might not have been. "Is that why you've had trouble staying in places?" she asked gently. "Because people see you as a unit rather than individuals?" Another meaningful look passed between them, and Willa sensed she was approaching the heart of their story. Partly, Eli admitted. Two men our size, traveling together, working together, living together, it makes people nervous. They assume we're looking for trouble, or that trouble follows us. And does it? Not the way you'd think, Jed said carefully. We've never started a fight, never stolen anything, never caused the kind of problems people expect from men our size. But sometimes our presence is enough to change the dynamics of a place. The story that emerged over the following hour was heartbreaking in its familiarity. Everywhere they'd worked, the pattern had been similar initial acceptance based on their obvious competence and work ethic, followed by gradual suspicion as their size and closeness made other workers uncomfortable, finally culminating in some incident that gave the community an excuse to ask them to leave. Last place was the worst, Eli said quietly. Farm outside Dodge City, like we mentioned before. We'd been there 6 months, longest anywhere since the orphanage. Started to think maybe we'd found a permanent home. What happened? Willa asked, though she dreaded the answer. Owner's daughter took a liking to Jed. Eli explained with a glance at his brother. Nice girl, maybe 20 years old, used to bring lunch to the fields, always made sure to save the biggest portions for us. Jed's discomfort was evident, but he continued the story. She was kind, and I started to hope that maybe she saw something in me worth caring about. Not romantic exactly, but friendly, like maybe I could have a normal life, normal relationships. Then her father's prize bull got loose. Eli picked up the narrative. Charged towards some children playing near the fence. Jed saw it happening and ran to help, managed to turn the animal away before anyone got hurt. Sounds heroic, Willa observed. That's what the children's parents said initially, Jed replied bitterly. But by the next day, the story had changed. People started asking why the bull had gotten loose in the first place, whether someone might have startled it deliberately. The implication was clear. They thought you'd staged the whole thing, to look like a hero, or to get close to the owner's daughter, Eli said. Small minds see conspiracy where there's only coincidence. Within a week, we were being accused of everything from theft to assault. Easier to leave than try to prove our innocence. The pattern was depressingly familiar, the same cycle of suspicion and blame that Mrs. Henderson had hinted at after church. Willa found herself thinking about the recent thefts in Prairie Bend and wondering how long it would be before someone suggested the twins might be responsible. You think it might happen here too, she said, reading their expressions. It always does eventually, Jed said with resigned acceptance. People our size, without family or connections, moving from place to place, we're natural suspects when things go wrong. But you keep trying, keep looking for somewhere to belong. What else can we do, Eli asked simply. Give up and become the kind of men people expect us to be, live down to their worst assumptions. That night, after the twins had retired, Willa sat in her kitchen, thinking about the photograph and the story it represented. Two small boys who'd been abandoned by the world, who'd somehow managed to maintain their integrity and kindness despite years of rejection and suspicion. They'd survived the worst that life could offer and emerged as men of character, men worthy of respect and affection. She thought about Harold and the conversations they'd had about family, about the different ways people could belong to each other. He'd always maintained that blood relationships were less important than chosen ones, that the families people created for themselves were often stronger than the ones they were born into. Looking around her kitchen at the mended chairs, the polished surfaces, the signs of care and attention that had transformed her house back into a home, she realized that she was looking at the evidence of just such a chosen family. The twins had given her purpose and hope and the simple pleasure of caring for people who appreciated her efforts. In return, she was determined to give them what they'd been searching for their entire adult lives: acceptance, security, and the knowledge that they were valued for who they were rather than feared for what they looked like. The foreclosure notice still represented a very real threat, and she knew that community acceptance would be a long, difficult process. But as she prepared for bed, Willa felt more confident than she had in years. They were building something precious together, not just a successful farm, but a family based on mutual respect and shared determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and sometimes that made all the difference in the world. The silver locket appeared on a Tuesday morning like an omen of disaster. Sheriff Garrett Morrison stood on Willa's front porch, holding the delicate piece of jewelry as if it might explode in his hands. His weathered face set in the grim expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Morning, Willa," he said, touching the brim of his hat with automatic courtesy. "I'm afraid we have a problem that needs addressing." Willa felt her stomach drop even before he explained. She'd known Sheriff Morrison for 20 years. She'd been one of Harold's closest friends, had served as a pallbearer at the funeral, had checked on her regularly during the dark months after she'd lost her husband. The fact that he was conducting official business rather than making a social call meant that whatever had brought him here was serious. "What kind of problem?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Mrs. Henderson's silver locket has been found," Morrison said carefully. "The one that went missing from her parlor last month. I'm afraid it turned up in circumstances that require investigation." Through the kitchen window, Willa could see Jed and Eli working in the apple orchard, their movements efficient and purposeful as they prepared the trees for the coming harvest. They looked like what they were, hard-working men focused on their tasks, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. "Where did you find it?" Willa asked, though something in the sheriff's expression told her she already knew. Morrison held up a small burlap sack that Willa recognized immediately. Eli used it to carry his wood-carving tools when he worked on projects in the orchard, and she'd seen him with it just the evening before. "Found it in this bag, which was discovered in the barn, where your hired men have been staying," Morrison said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Mrs. Henderson identified the locket positively, says it belonged to her grandmother, has distinctive engraving on the back." The words hit Willa like physical blows. She looked at the locket, noting its ornate Victorian design and the way morning sunlight caught the intricate metalwork. It was exactly the sort of family heirloom that would be both valuable and irreplaceable, the kind of theft that would outrage a small community and demand justice. "There has to be an explanation," she said firmly. "Jed and Eli would never steal anything. I'd stake my life on their honesty." "I hope you're right," Morrison replied, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "But the evidence needs to be addressed. I'm going to have to question them, search their belongings, follow proper procedures." "Of course," Willa said, though her mind was racing. "But Sheriff, you've known me for 20 years. Have I ever shown poor judgment about character? Have I ever trusted the wrong people?" Morrison considered this carefully. "No, you haven't. Harold always said you could read people better than anyone he knew. But Willa, the locket was found in their possession. That's not something I can ignore, regardless of personal opinions." The confrontation that followed was conducted with the careful formality of men who knew each other well, but found themselves on opposite sides of an official matter. Sheriff Morrison called the twins in from the orchard and explained the situation with professional courtesy, while Jed and Eli listened with expressions that cycled through surprise, disbelief, and finally a familiar resignation that broke Willa's heart. "We've never seen that locket before," Jed said quietly when Morrison finished his explanation. "We've never been inside Mrs. Henderson's house, never had any reason to take anything from anyone." "The bag is yours, though?" Morrison asked, holding up the burlap sack. "Yes, sir," Eli admitted. "I use it to carry my carving tools, but I haven't had it with me for the past 2 days. Been working on fence repairs and didn't need the tools." "When did you last remember having it?" Eli thought carefully. "Sunday evening, I think. Left it in the barn when we came in for dinner. Haven't thought about it since." Morrison nodded, making notes in his official tablet. "I'm going to need to search your belongings, examine the barn where you've been staying. Standard procedure in theft investigations." The search was thorough and respectful, but it yielded nothing beyond the locket itself. The twins' few possessions were examined carefully: changes of clothes, a few books, Jed's journal, Eli's carving tools. Everything was clean, organized, and exactly what one would expect from men of modest means and careful habits. But the absence of other stolen goods didn't diminish the impact of finding Mrs. Henderson's locket. If anything, it made the discovery more Dominga, single, carefully selected theft, rather than the indiscriminate grabbing of obvious criminals. As Sheriff Morrison prepared to leave, Willa found herself studying the twins' faces and seeing something that chilled her more than the accusation itself. They weren't surprised by this turn of events. Shocked by the specific nature of the evidence, yes, but not surprised by the fact that they were being accused of wrongdoing. "This has happened before," she said, the realization hitting her like a revelation. "Yes, ma'am," Jed confirmed quietly. "Different details, same pattern. Something goes missing, suspicion falls on the strangers, evidence appears in our belongings." "You're saying someone planted the locket?" "Hard to prove," Eli said with the weariness of men who'd fought this battle before. "Who's going to believe that upstanding community members would frame a couple of drifters?" Sheriff Morrison finished his paperwork and prepared to leave, but Willa could see the conflict in his expression. He was a fair man who took his duties seriously, but he was also someone who'd known her long enough to trust her judgment about people. "No charges yet," he said finally, "but I'll need you boys to stay available while I investigate further, and Mrs. Langford, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep an eye on things here." After he left, the three of them sat in Willa's kitchen in silence that felt heavier than grief. The twins stared at their hands, while Willa tried to process what had just happened and what it meant for their future. "Who would do this?" she asked finally. "Who would plant evidence to frame you?" "Could be anyone," Jed said with bitter experience. "Someone who wants us gone. Someone who sees an opportunity to solve multiple problems at once." "The missing chickens, the stolen tools," Eli added. "Easy to blame it all on the strangers once you establish a pattern." Willa thought about the conversation with Mrs. Henderson after church, about the barely concealed suspicion in some community members' faces, about the way certain people had been watching the twins with calculating eyes. "But why?" she asked. "What would anyone gain by driving you away?" The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks, and she sensed they were debating how much to tell her. It was Jed who finally spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Sometimes it's not about what people gain," he said. "Sometimes it's about what they fear losing. Two strong men without family connections, without property or standing in the community, we represent change, uncertainty. Some folks prefer the devil they know to the angel they don't." "Or," Eli added quietly, "someone might see opportunity in our departure. A farm in financial trouble, a widow who might be more willing to sell if she loses her help." The implication hit Willa like a slap. Someone wanted her to fail, wanted her to lose the farm, and the twins were simply obstacles to be removed. The personal nature of the attack made it feel even more vicious than random prejudice. "Cornelius Thorne," she said, the name emerging from her lips before she'd consciously made the connection. "The banker?" Jed asked. "He was very interested in arranging a quick sale of the property." Willa explained, her mind racing as pieces began falling into place. "Said he had buyers lined up, seemed eager to foreclose rather than work out payment arrangements. You think he planted the locket?" "I think someone did, and I think it's connected to the farm and the foreclosure. Too convenient that this happens just when we're starting to make real progress, just when it looks like we might actually be able to save the place." The twins listened as she worked through her theory, but she could see skepticism in their expressions. They'd been accused too many times, disappointed by too many broken promises of justice, to put much faith in the possibility of proving their innocence. "Even if you're right," Eli said gently, "how do you prove it? Who's going to believe that a respected banker would frame a couple of drifters?" "I don't know yet," Willa admitted, "but I'm not going to let you be driven away by lies. This is your home now, and I protect what's mine." Despite her brave words, she could see that the twins were already beginning the familiar process of emotional withdrawal. They were packing mentally, if not physically, preparing themselves for another departure, another search for a place that might accept them. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the farm settling around her. Willa found herself thinking about justice and truth, and the way small communities could turn against outsiders when fear overcame decency. The twins had done nothing wrong, but they were preparing to sacrifice themselves to spare her the scandal of association with accused thieves. She couldn't let that happen. For their sake, for her own sake, and for the sake of the family they'd built together, she had to find a way to expose the truth and protect the people she'd come to love, like sons. The silver locket was still evidence in an official investigation, but it was also a clue to be followed. Someone had taken a significant risk to plant it, which meant they had something important to gain from the twins' departure. All she had to do was figure out who stood to benefit most from her failure and their disgrace. Tomorrow, she would begin asking questions, and she wouldn't stop until she had answers. The confrontation with Cornelius Thorne took place at his office in town, in the austere room where Harold had once signed papers for their original farm loan. Willa sat across from the banker's polished desk, Harold's old surveyor's compass in her hand like a talisman of moral direction, watching Thorne's face as she laid out her suspicions with the calm precision of someone who'd spent sleepless nights organizing her thoughts. "You're suggesting I planted evidence to frame your hired men?" Thorne said when she finished, his voice carrying the kind of controlled outrage that might have intimidated someone with less at stake. "Mrs. Langford, I understand you're under considerable stress, but such accusations border on slander. I'm suggesting that someone with access to Mrs. Henderson's house and a strong interest in my farm's failure might have seen an opportunity." Willa replied steadily, "You've made no secret of wanting to foreclose quickly, of having buyers lined up for my property." Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the calculating expression of a man assessing an opponent's strengths and weaknesses. The morning light streaming through his office window caught the sharp angles of his face, emphasizing the predatory intelligence that had made him successful in a profession that required exploiting others' desperation. "Even if such a fantastic theory were true," he said carefully, "how would you propose to prove it?" "The evidence against your men is quite solid. The locket was found in their possession. They have no alibi for the time it was stolen, and their history suggests a pattern of trouble following them from place to place." The casual mention of their history told Willa everything she needed to know. Thorne had investigated the twins' background, had discovered their pattern of being accused and driven from communities, and had decided to exploit that vulnerability. "What did you offer Mrs. Henderson?" she asked directly. "Money? Promise to solve her theft problem? Assurance that the dangerous strangers would be removed from the community?" Something flickered in Thorne's eye, surprise, perhaps, that she'd made such a direct accusation. For a moment, his careful mask slipped, and she saw the calculating mind working behind his professional facade. "I think this conversation has gone far enough," he said, rising from his chair. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it to Sheriff Morrison. Otherwise, I suggest you focus your energy on preparing for the inevitable foreclosure proceedings." But Willa had seen what she needed to see, the slight tightening around his eyes when she'd mentioned Mrs. Henderson, the way his hand had moved unconsciously toward his desk drawer, the defensive shift in his posture, all of it, confirmed her suspicions. She left his office more determined than ever to expose the truth, but also realistic about the challenges she faced. Thorne was right about one thing. Proving conspiracy would require more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. She needed facts, witnesses, something that would stand up to official scrutiny. Her next stop was Doc Henley's office, where she found the elderly physician tending to young Tommy Miller's broken arm. Doc Henley had been Prairie Bend's moral compass for 40 years, the kind of man people trusted with their secrets and their children's lives. If anyone could provide guidance about handling community politics and hidden agendas, it would be him. "Willa," he said warmly after Tommy and his mother left. "How are you holding up? I heard about the trouble with your hired men." "That's what I wanted to discuss," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I think they're being framed, and I think I know why." Doc Henley listened carefully as she explained her theory about Thorne's involvement, asking pointed questions that helped her organize her thoughts and identify the weaknesses in her case. When she finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, his weathered hands folded as he considered her words. "You're talking about serious accusations," he said finally. "Cornelius Thorne has been a respected member of this community for 15 years. People trust him with their life savings, their business dealings. To suggest he'd stoop to framing innocent men." "I know how it sounds," Willa interrupted, "but consider the timing, the convenience of the evidence, the way it serves his interests perfectly. And Mrs. Henderson, you're suggesting she's part of this conspiracy?" Willa hesitated, because this was the weakest part of her theory. She couldn't imagine the elderly widow actively participating in such a scheme, but she could envision scenarios where Mrs. Henderson might have been manipulated or deceived. "I think she's been used," she said finally, maybe convinced that the twins really are dangerous, maybe offered some incentive to cooperate in getting them removed from the community. Doc Henley nodded slowly. "It's possible, I suppose. Eleanor Henderson has been struggling since her husband died, both financially and emotionally. She might be vulnerable to someone offering simple solutions to complex problems." "Will you help me?" Willa asked directly. "You know everyone in this community, understand how things really work. I need allies if I'm going to expose the truth." "What are you planning?" "Town meeting," Willa said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. "Public forum where I can present my case, ask the questions that need asking, force people to confront the truth instead of hiding behind gossip and assumptions." Doc Henley's eyebrows rose. "That's a considerable risk. If you're wrong, or if you can't prove your accusations, you'll be the one driven from the community. And if I'm right but do nothing, 2 innocent men will be destroyed, and I'll lose everything Harold and I built together." She gripped the surveyor's compass tighter, feeling its familiar weight. Some things are worth the risk. That afternoon, she returned home to find the twins packing their few belongings with the methodical efficiency of men who'd performed this ritual too many times. They moved around the barn like ghosts, carefully folding clothes, organizing tools, preparing for another departure from another place that had briefly felt like home. "You're leaving," she said, though it wasn't really a question. "Best for everyone," Jed replied without looking up from his packing. "Stay much longer, and we'll just bring more trouble to your door. What if I told you I think I know who's really responsible for the frame-up?" Eli paused in his packing, but his expression remained resigned. "Wouldn't matter much. Once suspicion attaches to men like us, it's hard to shake off. Better to move on before things get worse." "Better for who?" Willa demanded, surprising them with the force of her anger. "Better for the people who want you gone? Better for whoever's trying to steal my farm? Or better for the cowards who'd rather run than fight for what's right?" The accusation of cowardice stung, as she'd intended it to. Both twins straightened, their faces flushing with the kind of anger that came from having their honor questioned. "We're not cowards," Jed said quietly, but his voice carried an edge of steel. "We're being practical. Every place we've tried to stay, the same pattern emerges. Better to leave on our own terms than be run out by a mob." "This isn't every place," Willa shot back. "This is home. This is family. This is worth fighting for." She saw something shift in their expressions, a flicker of hope battling against years of learned helplessness. They wanted to believe her, wanted to think that this time might be different, but experience had taught them that hoping too hard only made the inevitable disappointment more painful. "What are you proposing?" Eli asked carefully. "A town meeting, public forum, where we can present the truth, ask the hard questions, force people to look at the evidence objectively instead of jumping to convenient conclusions." The twins exchanged one of their meaningful looks, and she could see them weighing risks against potential rewards. They'd spent 7 years running from accusations and starting over in new places. The prospect of finally standing and fighting clearly appealed to them, but it also terrified them. "And if we're wrong?" Jed asked. "If we can't prove our innocence or identify the real culprit?" "Then we'll face whatever comes together," Willa said simply. "As a family." That evening, They sat around her kitchen table, planning their approach with the careful attention of generals preparing for a crucial battle. Willa had sent word to Pastor Williams, requesting that a community meeting be held the following Sunday after church services, citing matters of community concern that require public discussion. She knew that such a meeting would draw nearly everyone in Prairie Bend. Small towns thrived on drama and gossip, and the prospect of public accusations and revelations would prove irresistible to most residents. The challenge would be maintaining control of the narrative and preventing the meeting from degenerating into a mob scene. "We need to be methodical," she said, studying the notes she'd made. "Present the timeline clearly, highlight the inconsistencies in the case against you, and then ask the questions that expose the real motivation behind the frame-up. People won't want to believe that one of their own could do such a thing," Eli observed. "Easier to accept that strangers are guilty than to admit they've been deceived by someone they trust. Which is why we need more than accusations," Jed added. "We need proof, or at least enough evidence to create reasonable doubt." They spent the next hour reviewing everything they knew about the theft, the discovery of the locket, and the timing of events. Willa made careful notes about Thorne's behavior during their confrontation, the banker's knowledge of the twins' history, and the suspicious convenience of the evidence. But as the evening progressed, she realized that their case, while logical, was largely circumstantial. They could raise questions and point out inconsistencies, but they couldn't definitively prove that anyone had planted evidence or manipulated Mrs. Henderson. "It might not be enough," she admitted finally. "We might not be able to prove your innocence beyond doubt." "Then why take the risk?" Eli asked gently. "Why put yourself through the humiliation of public failure?" Willa looked around her kitchen, noting all the small improvements the twins had made: the mended chairs, the repaired window frames, the carefully maintained surfaces that spoke of people who took pride in their surroundings. This wasn't just about clearing their names or saving her farm. It was about standing up for the principle that good people shouldn't be driven away by lies and prejudice, because some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't guarantee victory, she said. Because running away from injustice only encourages more of it, because if we don't stand up for what's right, who will? She reached for Harold's old Bible, turning to a passage that had sustained her through the darkest months after his death. "The truth will set you free," she read aloud, "but first you have to be willing to speak it, even when speaking it puts you at risk." The twins listened as she continued reading, drawing strength from words that had comforted believers for centuries. When she finished, they sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about courage, truth, and the price of standing up to powerful people who preferred darkness to light. "All right," Jed said finally, "we'll fight, but we fight together, and we accept whatever consequences follow." "Together," Eli agreed, reaching across the table to clasp his brother's hand and then Willa's. "Whatever happens." As they prepared for bed that night, Willa felt a mixture of fear and determination that reminded her of the early days of her marriage, when she and Harold had taken on the challenge of building a life together despite limited resources and uncertain prospects. They'd succeeded then, through hard work, mutual support, and unwavering commitment to their shared goals. Now she faced a different kind of challenge, but the principles remained the same. She had family worth protecting, truth worth defending, and a future worth fighting for. The town meeting would determine whether Prairie Bend was the kind of community that valued justice over convenience, truth over prejudice. She fell asleep holding Harold's compass, taking comfort in its steady weight, and the knowledge that her late husband would have been proud of the stand she was taking. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds, and some principles were worth defending, even at personal cost. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation she'd been preparing for, the moment when she would risk everything on her belief that good people, when presented with the truth, would choose to do the right thing. It was a leap of faith, but then again, the best things in life usually were. The Prairie Bend Community Church had never held so many people within its modest walls. Every pew was packed, with additional chairs borrowed from the schoolhouse lining the center aisle and people standing 3 deep along the back and side walls. The Sunday service had ended an hour ago, but no one had left. The prospect of public drama involving theft, accusations, and community outsiders had drawn every resident within a 10-mile radius. Willa sat in the front row beside Jed and Eli, acutely aware of the conversations buzzing behind them like angry wasps. She could hear fragments, never trusted them, too convenient. Poor Willa's been deceived, that told her exactly how the community mood was running. The twins sat with the quiet dignity that had characterized them from the beginning, their hands folded, their faces calm, despite the hostile atmosphere surrounding them. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit with the town meeting gavel that had been used for community decisions since Prairie Bend's founding. His expression was grave, but fair. He clearly understood the significance of what was about to unfold and the lasting impact it would have on community relationships. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed sanctuary, "we're here to address serious matters that affect our entire community. I ask that everyone conduct themselves with the dignity and respect that this sanctuary deserves, and that all parties be given fair opportunity to speak their piece." The formality of his words couldn't disguise the tension crackling through the room. This wasn't a typical community meeting about road repairs or school funding. This was a trial by public opinion, with the twins' future and Willa's reputation hanging in the balance. "Mrs. Langford has requested this meeting," Pastor Williams continued. "Willa, the floor is yours." Willa rose slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but standing before her neighbors, with their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile, made her throat feel suddenly dry. She gripped Harold's compass in her pocket, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "Friends and neighbors," she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I stand before you today not just as someone defending her hired help, but as someone defending the principles that make a community worth living in." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not entirely approving. Mrs. Henderson sat in the third row, with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a hard line. Behind her, Cornelius Thorne watched with the expression of someone confident in his position, but annoyed by the necessity of public theater. 3 weeks ago, a silver locket was discovered in the belongings of Jed and Eli Coulter, Willa continued. Based on that discovery, they've been accused of theft and branded as criminals. But I'm here to tell you that this evidence was planted, and that these two men are being framed by someone with a clear motive for wanting them gone. The murmur became a rumble of shocked conversation. Several people called out objections. "Proof! Where's your evidence?" while others shushed them to hear more. Pastor Williams tapped the gavel for order. "Let Mrs. Langford speak her piece," he said firmly. "Consider the timeline," Willa said, raising her voice to carry over the crowd. "The locket was allegedly stolen from Mrs. Henderson's parlor 4 weeks ago. But it wasn't discovered in Eli's tool bag until 3 days ago. Why would experienced thieves keep stolen goods in their possession for 3 weeks? Why not sell it immediately or hide it somewhere less obvious? Maybe they were waiting for things to cool down, someone called from the back. Or maybe, Willa replied, someone else had the locket and planted it when they needed to create evidence against innocent men. She could see doubt beginning to creep into some faces, but others remained skeptical. Mrs. Henderson stood up abruptly, her face flushed with indignation. "Are you suggesting I'm lying about my own property?" she demanded. "That locket belonged to my grandmother. I know it was stolen, and I know where it was found. I'm not questioning whether the locket is yours or whether it was stolen," Willa replied carefully. "I'm questioning how it ended up where it was found and who might have benefited from its discovery." "This is ridiculous," Cornelius Thorne said, rising from his seat with theatrical outrage. "Mrs. Langford is clearly desperate to protect men who've deceived her trust. The evidence speaks for itself." "Does it?" Willa asked, turning to face him directly. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne, how did you know about Jed and Eli's history in other towns? How did you know they'd faced similar accusations before?" The question caught Thorne off guard. His eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise or calculation before settling back into professional composure. Sheriff Morrison mentioned it during his investigation, he said smoothly. Such information becomes common knowledge in a small community. But Sheriff Morrison only learned about their history after the locket was found, Willa pressed. Yet you seemed to know about it when I spoke with you yesterday morning. How do you explain that? The silence that followed was electric. Every person in the room was now paying complete attention, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than simple accusations and denials. I may have heard rumors, Thorne said carefully. In my position, people often share information about newcomers to the community. What people? Willa asked. Who told you about their past troubles? Thorne's composure was beginning to crack. She could see him calculating responses, trying to find safe ground in an increasingly treacherous conversation. I don't recall specifically, he said. Conversations blend together when you deal with as many people as I do. But his evasion only made him look more guilty. Several community members were now watching him with the same suspicion they'd previously directed at the twins. Let me ask a different question, Willa said, sensing momentum shifting in her favor. Who stands to benefit if Jed and Eli are driven from the community? Who gains if my farm fails and I'm forced to sell quickly? Mrs. Langford, Pastor Williams interrupted gently, these are serious accusations you're making. Yes, they are, she agreed. Just as serious as the accusations against two innocent men who've done nothing but work hard and try to build honest lives. She turned back to the crowd, noting how the atmosphere in the room had changed. Where before there had been hostility toward the twins, now there was uncertainty, doubt, a growing sense that they might be witnessing injustice rather than justice. I've known Jed and Eli for 6 weeks, she said. In that time they've rebuilt my farm, shown kindness to children and respect to elders, attended church faithfully, and asked for nothing more than honest work and a place to belong. Everything about their character contradicts the accusations against them. Character references don't overcome physical evidence, Mrs. Henderson said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. What evidence? Willa challenged. A locket that could have been planted by anyone with access to your home and knowledge of where the twins keep their belongings. Evidence that conveniently appeared at exactly the right time to destroy their reputation and force their departure. The crowd was becoming restless, but not in the way she'd feared. Instead of growing more hostile toward her and the twins, they were beginning to ask questions among themselves, to look at familiar faces with new suspicion, to wonder if they'd been too quick to accept convenient explanations for complex problems. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Doc Henley stood up slowly, his weathered hands gripping the pew in front of him as he prepared to speak. The crowd fell silent immediately. He was one of the most respected members of the community, someone whose word carried weight with everyone present. I have something to add to this discussion, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. Something I witnessed, but didn't think significant until now. Willa felt her heart racing as Doc Henley stepped into the center aisle, positioning himself where everyone could see and hear him clearly. 3 days ago, the same day the locket was discovered, I was making an early morning house call to the Williams farm. He began. On my way back to town, I saw Cornelius Thorne leaving Mrs. Henderson's property just after sunrise. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale, while Thorne's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching panic. That's, Thorne began, but Doc Henley continued. I thought it odd at the time, since the bank doesn't normally conduct business before dawn. When I mentioned it to Cornelius later that day, he claimed he'd been checking on Mrs. Henderson's welfare as a concerned community member. Which is exactly what I was doing, Thorne said quickly, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. Perhaps, Doc Henley agreed, but I also noticed that he was carrying a small bag when he left her property. A bag very similar to the one that allegedly contained the stolen locket when it was found later that same day. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room was now fixed on Cornelius Thorne, whose careful composure was crumbling under the weight of direct evidence. This is preposterous, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Dr. Henley is mistaken about what he saw." "Am I?" Doc Henley asked mildly. "I've been making house calls for 40 years, Cornelius. I know what I see, and I remember details that matter." "Mrs." Henderson stood up abruptly, her face a mask of confusion and growing anger. "Cornelius, what were you doing at my house before dawn? I never invited you over, never asked for any assistance." "I was concerned about your welfare," Thorne repeated, but the explanation sounded increasingly desperate. "As a neighbor, as someone who cares about community members. Concerned enough to enter my home without permission?" Mrs. Henderson's voice was rising. "Concerned enough to be there when I was still asleep?" The crowd was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about a stolen locket, it was about a conspiracy to frame innocent men and destroy a widow's chances of saving her farm. "Tell them about your keys, Eleanor," Doc Henley said gently. "Tell them about the spare key your husband always kept hidden for emergencies." Mrs. Henderson's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. "The key under the loose board on the back porch," she whispered. "Henry always said I was too trusting, that I should find a better hiding place. A hiding place that would be known to anyone who'd done business with your late husband," Doc Henley observed. "Anyone who might have visited your property regularly over the years." All eyes turned back to Thorne, whose face was now flushed with a combination of anger and fear. The careful mask of respectability had slipped completely, revealing the calculating mind beneath. "This is all speculation and innuendo," he said desperately. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing on my part." "Don't we?" Willa asked, sensing that the moment had come for her final revelation. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the afternoon light, streaming through the church windows. It was Mrs. Henderson's silver locket. The crowd erupted in confused conversation. How could Willa have the locket if it was evidence in Sheriff Morrison's investigation? How could it be in two places at once? "This is the real Mrs. Henderson's locket," Willa announced, raising her voice above the commotion. "The one that Sheriff Morrison has in evidence is a fakeer, very good fake, but a fake nonetheless." Mrs. Henderson reached for the locket with trembling hands, examining it closely. "This is my grandmother's locket," she confirmed, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'd know the engraving anywhere, but where did you find it?" "In Cornelius Thorne's office desk," Willa said simply, "where he left it after commissioning a replica to plant in Eli's belongings." The accusation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Thorne went white, then red, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he struggled to form a response. "You searched my office," he finally managed. "That's breaking and entering. That's justice," Sheriff Morrison said from the back of the room. All heads turned to see him standing in the church doorway, his hand resting on his gun belt and his expression grim. "Willa came to me yesterday with her suspicions. We've been investigating quietly ever since." The sheriff moved through the crowd with deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving Thorne's face. Amazing what you can learn when you start asking the right questions. Like why the bank president would commission a replica locket from the silversmith in Dodge City. Like why you've been so eager to foreclose on the Langford farm when other arrangements could easily be made. "You can't prove anything," Thorne said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Can't we?" Morrison pulled out a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Signed receipt for one replica silver locket, Victorian design, commissioned by Cornelius Thorne. Delivered 3 days ago, the same day the evidence was discovered." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what was being revealed. "Why?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you use me, manipulate me, make me complicit in framing innocent men?" Thorne's composure finally cracked completely. Years of careful planning, of manipulating community sentiment and exploiting prejudice, had been undone by one doctor's observant eyes and one widow's determination to protect her family. "The farm is worth twice what the loan balance represents," he said bitterly. "Prime land, good water rights, perfect for development. I had buyers lined up, investors ready to pay top dollar for quick acquisition. So you decided to steal it," Jed said quietly. It was the first time either twin had spoken during the meeting, and his words carried the weight of men who'd finally seen justice prevail. "I was conducting business," Thorne replied weakly. "Legal foreclosure proceedings based on legitimate debt obligations. By framing innocent men and manipulating a grieving widow," Sheriff Morrison said with obvious disgust. "Cornelius Thorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy, theft, fraud, and filing false police reports." As Morrison moved to place handcuffs on the banker, the crowd erupted in a mixture of outrage, shock, and grudging admiration for Willa's courage in exposing the truth. Voices that had been suspicious of the twins an hour earlier now called out apologies and offers of support. Mrs. Henderson approached Jed and Eli with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "I was used, manipulated, but that doesn't excuse the harm I helped cause." "You were a victim too," Eli replied gently. "No apology necessary." Pastor Williams called for order, but the energy in the room had completely transformed. Where before there had been suspicion and hostility, now there was relief, vindication, and a collective sense that justice had been served. As Sheriff Morrison led Thorne from the church, Willa felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The truth had indeed set them free, but the cost had been higher than she'd anticipated. Trust had been broken, relationships strained, and the community would need time to heal from the wounds of deception and prejudice. But they had won. The twins were vindicated, the farm was safe, and their family was intact. Sometimes that was all that mattered. 6 months later, the Langford apple orchard bloomed with a vigor that hadn't been seen in a decade. Willa stood at her kitchen window on a crisp spring morning, watching Jed and Eli tend the trees with the careful attention of men who understood they were nurturing something precious and permanent. The familiar ache of loss that had shadowed her days since Harold's death had softened into something more manageable, forgotten, but balanced by new joys and purposes that made each sunrise worth celebrating. The transformation of both the farm and the community had been remarkable to witness. Where once there had been charred ruins and struggling vegetation, now there were thriving gardens, rebuilt structures, and the kind of prosperity that came from skilled hands, guided by hopeful hearts. The twins had thrown themselves into every improvement project with the enthusiasm of men who finally believed their efforts would benefit them personally, rather than simply preparing the ground for others to inherit. But the changes went beyond mere physical restoration. The events of that dramatic Sunday in the church had forced Prairie Bend to confront its own capacity for prejudice and deception, and the community had emerged from that confrontation with a deeper understanding of the difference between reputation and character, between convenience and justice. Mrs. Henderson had become one of the twins' most vocal supporters, her guilt over her unwitting participation in Thorne's scheme transformed into fierce protectiveness toward the men she'd helped in danger. She visited the farm regularly, bringing her famous apple pies and staying for long conversations about gardening, faith, and the complexity of human nature. Her friendship had helped heal wounds that went deeper than the immediate crisis. The traveling artist who passed through Prairie Bend each spring had captured the new reality in a portrait that now hung above Willa's mantelpiece. It showed the three of them standing together in front of the rebuilt barn, Willa in the center with her hands on both men's arms, all of them smiling with the genuine warmth of people who'd found their place in the world. The painting had become a source of quiet pride and a daily reminder of how far they'd all traveled from that desperate morning when two strangers had appeared at her fence asking for work. The legal proceedings following Thorne's arrest had revealed the scope of his schemes and the vulnerability of other community members who'd been targeted for similar manipulation. The banker had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, his property sold to satisfy the claims of people he'd defrauded. The scandal had rocked Prairie Bend's sense of security, but it had also strengthened the community's commitment to protecting its more vulnerable members. Doc Henley stopped by that morning, as he did every few weeks, ostensibly to check on everyone's health, but really to enjoy the coffee and conversation that had become one of his favorite breaks from medical duties. He found them gathered around the kitchen table, planning the summer's expansion of the vegetable garden, their heads bent over seed catalogues and planting charts, with the focused attention of people who took their responsibilities seriously. "Looks like you're planning to feed half the county," he observed, settling into the chair that had become his customary seat. "Planning to feed ourselves well, and have plenty left over for neighbors," Willa corrected with a smile. "Amazing how much food 3 people can grow when they put their minds to it. And when 2 of those people have the strength to move mountains," Eli added with the gentle humor that had become more apparent as his confidence grew. The conversation turned to community news, marriages and births, business developments, the progress of the new school building that was being constructed with lumber milled from trees on their property. The twins had donated both materials and labor to the project, their contribution helping to cement their place as valued community members rather than temporary residents. "Speaking of community involvement," Doc Henley said with a meaningful look at Jed, "I heard Pastor Williams is hoping you'll consider running for the school board next election." Jed's surprise was evident. "Me? I don't know anything about running schools." "You know about education, about the importance of learning, about treating children with respect and kindness," Doc Henley replied. "That's more qualification than half the men who've served on that board." It was a remarkable suggestion that a man who'd once been driven from communities as a suspected criminal might now be considered for a position of civic responsibility. The offer represented not just personal vindication, but a fundamental shift in how the community viewed the twins and their place in Prairie Bend's future. That afternoon, as they worked together in the orchard, Willa found herself reflecting on the changes that 6 months had brought to all their lives. The trees they tended together would bear fruit for decades to come, providing sustenance and income for future generations of whatever family chose to call this place home. The thought filled her with a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere financial security. She'd spent 2 years after Harold's death believing that her productive life was over, that the best she could hope for was to maintain what they'd built together until age or circumstance forced her to give it up. The arrival of the twins had changed that calculation completely, giving her not just the physical help she needed, but the emotional purpose she hadn't known she was missing. "Willa," Jed said, interrupting her thoughts, "Eli and I have been talking about something, and we wanted to discuss it with you." The serious tone in his voice caught her attention immediately. They'd learned to communicate openly about practical matters, but this carried the weight of something more significant. "What's on your minds?" "The farm's doing well enough that we could probably afford to hire additional help for the heavy work," Eli said carefully. "Maybe take on some of the young men in town who are looking for steady employment." "That's a good idea," Willa agreed, though she sensed there was more to their proposal. "We were thinking it might be time to make this arrangement more formal," Jed continued. "Legal papers, official partnership agreements, clear understanding of how decisions get made and profits get shared." The suggestion surprised her, not because she disagreed with it, but because she'd become so comfortable with their informal family structure that she'd stopped thinking about the need for legal protections. But they were right. Success brought its own complications, and a growing enterprise needed the security of proper documentation. "Are you worried that I might change my mind about the partnership?" she asked gently. "Not worried exactly," Eli said, "but we want to make sure that if something happens to any of us, the others are protected, that this place stays in the family we've built together." The phrase, "the family we've built together," encapsulated everything that had changed since that desperate morning when they'd first appeared at her fence. They weren't employer and employees, weren't even just friends sharing resources. They were family in the truest sense, people who'd chosen each other, who'd stood together through crisis, who'd committed to a shared future, regardless of what challenges it might bring. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded her of the morning Harold had first shown her this land, Willa felt a peace that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to remember. The farm was thriving, the community had accepted them completely, and the future stretched ahead with the promise of continued growth and prosperity. She thought about the question she'd asked in the very beginning: have you ever lost everything you thought would last forever? The answer was yes, she had lost everything. But she'd also learned that losing everything wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that could be even richer and more meaningful than what had come before. The twins had saved her farm, but more importantly, they'd saved her hope. In return, she'd given them something they'd been searching for: their entire adult, live-ser place to belong, a family to call their own, and the security of knowing they were valued for who they were rather than feared for what they looked like. As they gathered around the dinner table that evening, sharing the simple meal of vegetables from their garden and bread from their wheat, Willa offered the blessing that had become their family tradition. For this food, for this home, for the family we've chosen and the love we share, we give thanks. And for tomorrow's possibilities, we offer our hope and our commitment to face whatever comes together. Sometimes, she reflected as they joined hands around the table, salvation really did come walking up dusty roads with nothing but calloused hands and a promise to help. Sometimes the best families were the ones you built yourself, one choice at a time, one act of faith after another, until strangers became something more precious than blood relatives. They became home.